Nice to see you. Let me just, can I get this a bit higher? Yeah, that's worked really well. Sorry, can you help me? If you were with us last night, yeah, a little higher, that's right, because I'm very tall. Thank you. That's brilliant. Thank you. Thanks. If you were with us last night, you will have heard the fact that for a number of years I worked for a group called London Institute of Contemporary Christianity, and they were founded by John Stott. You may have heard of him, but what John Stott, he was a leader in the evangelical world really in the 20th century, wrote tons of books, and was the rector at All Souls, Langham Place, just outside the BBC there in the heart of London. And the reason he founded LICC in the 80s was because he was really concerned that evangelical Christians particularly were really good at Bible, really good at prayer, really good at church stuff, but actually found it difficult to know how does that world relate to the rest of their lives. In other words, that it would be easy for some people to think of a sacred secular divide. There's some things really matter to God, and then there's the rest of life. And I was working with that organization for 13 years, particularly with church leaders, both ordained and lay, folks like yourselves, to actually ask the question, how does our life as gathered church, the stuff we do in and around this sort of building, how does it equip us for our scattered lives? That relationship between gathered and scattered. Now, it's obvious that there's a direct link. And it's obvious that what we do here in places like this should actually equip, sustain, and nurture people for their scattered lives. Because people spend so much more time in scattered living than they do in gathered church activities. You may have heard this before, but let me tell you. In a week, there are 168 hours. That's not the bit you've never heard before. In a week, there's 168 hours. Let's assume you sleep for 48 of those hours every week. You may sleep more, you may sleep less, don't worry. But let's just assume 48 hours. That leaves 120 waking hours. For most people, the maximum number of hours they can give to gathered church activity, for most people, the maximum is around 10. Now, you're leaders of this place, so you may well be more involved than that, but I suspect you know lots of your congregation who are a lot less involved than that. So let's go for the maximum is 10. That leaves 110. 110 of scattered living. Always feeling part of the church, but scattered living. So the crucial question is, how does the 10 hours, our gathered life together, our explicit gathered life together, how does it equip us for the 110? For that is what it means to be church. Church gathered, church scattered. Now, most of my working life, I've been involved in church leadership at some level or other, either training or directly involved, etc., etc., etc. So my problem is that my focus in my working life has largely been the 10 for other people. Do you see what I mean? The gathered life of the church. But because I'm a church leader, I get a lot of airtime and column inches. I get a lot of uninterrupted speaking time. I get a lot of opportunities to communicate. And the danger is, because my focus is on the gathered church, I can give people the impression, unintentionally, that that's the most important thing. Let me explain with a very simple caricature of an anecdote how that works. What's your name, sir? Clive. Okay. Just go with me on this. Don't worry. Okay. Imagine that I'm the vicar here in this church. And Clive and Ruth, they visit one of our services. And I, as a vicar, will notice we've got new folks in our church. And it's brilliant. I don't know about you, but I never lose the joy of new folks coming to church. Yeah? Good. I just need to know that that's how you feel about it. I couldn't tell just from your mask. So, Clive and Ruth come one week, and it's great. They've come. They look normal. That's a bonus. And they're there. And we give them a good welcome, and off they go. And then, miracle of miracles, they come back the following week. Fantastic. After a few weeks or months, I might sit with Clive and say something along this line. Clive, it's been brilliant. You've been coming along. We've loved having you and Ruth be part of our church and worship during this time. And we're delighted you're with us. And we were just wondering, do you know how the rest of this conversation goes? You're ahead of me. Clive, do you play a bass guitar? Because we think we're one bassist away from revival. Do you play a guitar? You don't. That's disappointing. Clive, are you very handy with your hands? Do you sort of, are you a fixer? Are you a fixer or a bodger? You're not a fixer. So you don't want to join the maintenance team. That's disappointing. Clive, have you got a DBS that means you can work with children? Yeah, that's not quite as much as help as I imagined right now. Clive, beneath that mask, you've got a nice smile. Will you join our welcome team? And Clive, because now he's desperate and recognized as a desperate minister, will go, yeah, okay. Now, that's a conversation that is a little bit of a caricature, but not far off. And unwittingly and unintentionally, what I've done to Clive is say, I'm really glad Clive and Ruth are part of our church because we've got a machine to run. And the reason Jesus died for you on the cross all those years ago and raised to heaven and sits on the right hand of God is that you can join a rota. Now, what would it sound like if, after the same period of time, I sat with Clive and Ruth and said, delighted you've been with us, etc., etc. And we were just wondering, where's God already using you? And how can we as a congregation support you in that? That's a really simple switch. And Clive and Ruth may go, do you know, no one's ever asked us that before. But we would sit with them and we would say, well, where are you? What's happening? Who are you with? What's God placed on your heart? And how can belonging to this community enable you to be equipped, sustained, nurtured, appreciated, affirmed in that mission that God has for you and his purpose for your life? Now, there will be a moment, and an appropriate moment, where we say to Ruth and Clive, you're part of the family. Being part of this family means you get to wash up every now and again. But that's not your biggest ministry. That's just being part of the family. Being part of the family means that someone has to actually make sure stuff works. Being part of the family means that we do care for children. Being part of the family means that someone plays up here. Being part, etc., etc., etc. But actually, 110. Those 110 hours. Where's God already there? So that's what my heartbeat is. And I need to keep reminding people like me that that's the goal of all of this. Now, I kind of say it to you because as fellow leaders of a local congregation with different responsibilities and different levels of responsibility, I guess, that's why you're a leader of this congregation. Leadership of a congregation is not just keep the congregation going, but it's to equip the congregation to do the work of God that he has deemed before creation of time that they would do. That's why you're called into local leadership. Does that help? You see, the danger is that sometimes what we think of leadership in church becomes, can we just keep the building going? Or can we keep, some weeks it's like, can we just keep everybody happy? Or maybe that's just my church. And I've come to the conclusion, the answer is no. But that's what it means to be leaders. And that's kind of what I want to explore with us today. Now, we're at a particular moment, and if you were with me last night, then you know that I was speaking about the particular moment we're in the midst of this situation we face as a world at the moment. And last night I was sort of using that moment, which we've been told we're kind of like 6 months in. It's 6 months before, since the lockdown began, and they're saying it's going to be at least 6 months until we get back to any sort of what we would call normality. So here we are, and here you are as leaders of a congregation. And the danger is, I might want to suggest, or one of the things that has become really significant in my own thinking recently, the danger is that as leaders on PCCs or standing committees, whatever your role may be, is all of your focus is on how do we ensure that we can worship safely together during this time, and how will we prepare to get people back to normal? In other words, ironically, your focus becomes much more on the gathered to the exclusion of the scattered. Because there's stuff to think about. Sanitizer, face mask, lines, entry, exit. All of those important things. It's not that they're not important. But actually, what I want to do is remind you of the bigger calling that God has given you than just, can we get people in and out of this building safely? It's important to do that, but there's a bigger calling on your life. And it happens in the midst of this situation. Does that sound, that's what I want to talk about. Does that sound, I haven't got anything else, that's the problem. But does that sound like it's something worth spending our time together over? I'm going to read together. If you've got a Bible or you can, or a phone, do you want to turn with me to 1 Corinthians 7? I almost guarantee this would not be a passage you would expect me to preach or refer to. And I'm not really preaching from it, but just to refer to this morning. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and it's verse 25 onwards. And when you get there, you'll see why it's a bit of a surprise. Where I'm going to read is right in the middle of a long chapter where Paul is writing to the Corinthians and trying to help them make sense of their current situation. And you know that in the book of Corinthians, what happens is Paul begins the letter with a lot of the things that he's concerned about, and then it seems to be, and around this sort of chapter, he flips and he starts to write about things that they are concerned about. And perhaps a bit earlier as well. But here in the 7th chapter, he's talking about marital situations, people who are single, people who are kind of promised in marriage and all the rest of it, and people who are already married. And he's trying to help them make sense of their sort of domestic life, if you will. But in verse 25, he moves and he starts to talk to people who are not yet married or not married at all. Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Hear what he's saying. He's saying, a thought came to me. I don't know if this verse is ever in the lectionary, so you may never have heard this being read out in church. But now about virgins, he says, I've got nothing to say that Jesus didn't talk about this. But I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So he's saying, I don't know what Jesus would have necessarily said, but I'm coming to you and I'm giving you a word, a judgment. I'm giving you an insight and I'm trustworthy. That's what Paul says about himself. So in a sense, Paul is having to address a situation that Jesus hasn't addressed, which is pretty much what most of us have to do most of the time. It's the specifics that Jesus couldn't have spoken about. You know, what did Jesus think about fracking? What did Jesus say about fracking? Well, of course, the simple answer is nothing. He said nothing about it. So how do we make sense of it? Well, we base our thinking upon what we know of Jesus and extend it into new situations. And we acknowledge Jesus didn't say this, but we're trying to make sense of this. Because of the present crisis, I think it's good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Don't seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Don't look for a wife. But if you do marry, you've not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she's not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. There's a verse you never see on a fridge magnet. Although I think if you produce one, people would buy it. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who are married should live as if they weren't. Those who mourn, as if they didn't. Those who are happy, as if they weren't. Those who buy something, as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world, as if not engrossed in them. For this world, in its present form, is passing away. So, there's 3 references in those 2 paragraphs to a crisis. In verse 26, because of the present crisis. In verse 29, the time is short. And then verse 31, the final sentence. This world in its present form is passing away. I think one way of reading that is Paul is thinking that Jesus is just about to return. And that is often a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to what's Paul talking about that? Is, well, Jesus is coming, so therefore, stay as you are. And it's possible that that's what Paul was thinking. But there's another way, and I think for myself, a more compelling way of reading that. Because, of course, if you think it's the first, that Paul was fully expectant that Jesus was coming again, one has to say Paul was simply wrong. And that therefore Paul's advice to the Corinthians was not helpful. For he'd raised their expectation that Jesus would come again very soon in their lifetime. So if you're single, do not get married. If you're married, etc., etc. But that didn't happen, clearly. So another more compelling way of reading those verses are, well, what's the present crisis? Now, many people think what the present crisis was the crisis we read about last night in Acts 11. The famine, the severe famine that has covered the whole of the Roman world. Now, some people would say it's that. Some people would say it's some other crisis. But what lots of people would suggest is that the Corinthian church didn't need to be reminded what the crisis was, because everybody went, yeah, these are crisis days. And Paul, writing in the midst of a trouble, in a crisis, starts to say to them, this is how I want you to live in the midst of a crisis that you all recognize. And he ends with that verse that I read. For the world in its present form is passing away. When I was reading it felt like a verse for now. Isn't that verse what you have seen on the headlines of the newspapers and on the BBC website and the news? The world in its present form is passing away. And we do not yet know what it's going to look like. Because in a sense, this period we've lived through, or living through, has revealed some things and accelerated other things. Now, nobody's quite sure what will happen post-vaccine. Will we just snap back into the way we were in February? Or have some things changed to such an extent that we won't snap back? What will we do with our cities? I don't know what it's like around here. I actually don't really know the Wirral, but it struck me this morning driving to the Wirral in the sunshine. This is a nice place, isn't it? And yeah, I think you're right to keep it to yourself. It's a lovely, lovely place. I don't know what it's like around here for you, but I know in the Manchester area and other places, towns have died. We went to Suffolk for a holiday. We should have been in Nice, but we went to Suffolk for reasons that you'll all understand. It was a slight disappointment, but it was okay. But we drove and we stopped off at Grantham, a town that is absolutely, it was Saturday afternoon, 2:30. We went to look for a coffee halfway on our journey, to break our journey. It was like a ghost town. I don't need to talk. And it just felt like the world in its present form has passed away. It felt like a word for today. So how do we live? Well, what we've got to do is do what Paul says. Jesus didn't talk about, well, how are you going to do this? But what we do is we try and discern what the Spirit is saying in the context of this. And that's kind of what I want to do this morning. I wonder if you can take me to the next slide. This is a slide that you may have seen. If you've seen anything that LICC have ever done before, this is a slide you will have seen. Have you used this slide here? Do I need to explain it? Oh, Martin's really feeling disappointed now. He's going, yeah, I've explained this. And they're going, no, we've no idea. We've never seen this before. Do you know what? As a minister, do you know what the worst thing in the world is as a local minister? Is you get a visiting speaker come and say something, and everybody goes, they were brilliant. I've never heard that said before. And the minister's going, I've been banging on about that for 2 years. There's nothing more discouraging. So now you know how to discourage your minister. These red dots represent roughly the percentage of people in the UK that would worship in a Christian church of any denomination once a month or more. It's very difficult to get exact figures, but just go with this. 94% of people, roughly, are really glad we're here. In our area, where some of the churches are having to close, it's really interesting to see on Facebook the comments that happen. So some of the Anglican churches need to close, and people on Facebook go, well, the government should keep them open. It's a tragedy that these buildings are closed. I got married there in 1963, and some poor souls are going, have you been back since? That's not the point. You see, it's not that 94% of people are against the idea of church, it's just not for them. It's not for them. And it can feel like, as a worshiping community in much of the country, that you're very much in the minority. And the truth is, you are. And the truth is, if you've got children or grandchildren who go to church, they are very much in the minority in their school. When my children were young and at school age, in their school, of 900 pupils, there were 6 children in the whole of the 900 who went to church on a regular basis. So my children grew up as a very small minority in Salford. Now, when you see a picture like that, it can be tempting then to sort of, retreat. And you hear this from time to time. And you see it in all sorts of ways. You see it in some people who go, well, my church might close, but as long as it stays open to bury me, that'll be all right. Or other people who lose confidence in the gospel. I think there's a concern, I have a concern, if you've not seen many people come to Jesus midlife, a church can actually lose confidence that unless you're a cradle Christian, you are likely to come to Jesus. Do you know what I mean? That's why we've got to be active with our evangelism. Not only for the sake of those who need Jesus, but actually to remind one another, it works. It works. Otherwise, we think, well, if we're not baptizing children, then how will the church be? It's easy to become defensive. It's easy to become focused on oneself. But this is the church gathered. It's important that when the church is gathered, that they are read. Can you flick to the next slide and then the next slide after that? Not that one, that one. Because when we scatter, where we're in touch with so many people. One of the things that really pleased me last night was when we got to the end of, towards the end of the service, and I asked, well, you know, who are the marginalized, who are the poorest, who's meeting them? And the first person one of the first people who stood up and said, well, I'm a doctor, and I see those people who are most marginalized. I'm meeting them. Because actually, what's happening is, your congregation, when they scatter across the Wirral and much further, I'm imagining, actually are in touch with so many more people. But that picture only works if two things are true. One, when you scatter, you stay red. If you grey out, there's nothing to indicate there's anything different about you. And secondly, and most importantly, or just as importantly, is when you scatter, you own the place where you are. In a sense, you remind yourself, this is where God has planted me at this stage. Now, I said last night, it may not be where you'd want to be, but most of the Bible is written about people who didn't feel they're in the right place at the right time with the right people. But it's where you are. And some of you might feel frustrated because actually your world might have grown smaller, particularly during this crisis. If you've been locked down for a long time, you might feel your world has become a lot smaller than it was before. But this is where God has planted you. And the question is, what is God asking of you in this moment? Now, I'm also conscious that although for some people during the virus, it's been smaller, for other people, their life has just got far more complicated. My children are now in their 30s, but the thought of having to homeschool children when both of you are working from home in a relatively small house, I don't know. I'm not sure we would have come out of that we would have gone in with 4 members of the family. I'm not sure we'd have come out with 4 members. Do you know what I mean? I'm not sure who would have made it. My hat is well and truly off for anybody who's had to do that. Juggle homeschooling, working in a, smallish context. So for some people, it's become really much more difficult. For some people, their work has become incredibly stressful. But that's where God's placed you. Are you staying red? And are you placed there? And is belonging to this congregation enabling that to happen? Let's go back one slide if we can. So, here's a question for you to think about. During this last 6 months, what did we learn about ourselves as a church? What did we learn about ourselves, or what have we learned? And why is it significant? What do you think you've learned about yourself as a church? I'm going to give you a moment to chat together. But if I just give you a couple of thoughts about my own context, but it's just my context, this might be different for you. Number one, we found we were able to adapt remarkably quickly. I know that if I'd have said to my home groups, our home groups in February, let's meet on Zoom, I think it'll be great. People would have gone, oh no. If Jesus had meant us to meet on Zoom, and they would have said, we haven't got the tools, we haven't got the technology, I'm not learning anything new. All it took was Boris Johnson to say, don't go out, and we all learned. We were remarkably adaptable. If the crisis is big enough, we can make huge changes. We learned that about ourselves. Previously, we would have had to have church meetings. I'd have had to run around people to make sure they were all happy. I can imagine myself sitting in people's homes going, now you press this button, this one, 150 times, this one. But actually, we're remarkably adaptable. What did we learn? We learned that actually the thing we miss most about church is not the sermon, because we can do the sermon online. It's not, with respect, it's not listening to other people lead worship. What we really missed was proximity. We missed the incidental conversations where you hear what God's doing and you find out so much about one another. Now that's significant for us because when I think of, well, what will our life look like going forward? Two things that we've learned, there's lots of others, but two of those things. One is we can adapt quicker than we thought if the crisis is big enough. And secondly, all the stuff that happened before church service and after church service, when you take that away, that's what's missed the most. And it was a reminder to us that when, in our context, someone says the final prayer, the benediction, the prayer of sending, the real work of God's people begin. And it kind of echoed what we always knew, that the coffee time for us at the end of service was a vital part of our gathering. It was absolutely vital. So those are two things that we learned. However, you may have learned lots more. So just have a look around. You see who's with you, and have a little chat with them. And what I don't really want is for you to all say, yeah, we said those two things as well. So come up with other things as well. What do you think your church has learned during this time, and why is it significant? Is that okay? I know you could be having bacon sandwiches right now, but come on. Okay, great. Okay, I wonder whether we can just get some feedback. What did we learn about ourselves? If you indicate, I'll come close to you so you can tell me and then I can repeat it to everybody. What did you learn? What did you say? Yeah. Okay, so if I've got this right, then you'd loaded up your leadership team, but actually there were new skills and gifts that you needed to address a new situation. Essentially, what this was doing was, this is my comment, not yours, we were taking the church from essentially a similar pattern to the one that was in 1950s, where we expected people simply to come to us, and now we recognize that we needed people with new technology and skills to enter into the 21st century, where people communicate and contact each other very differently. And wasn't it interesting that when we realized that we couldn't just guarantee meeting people who were coming to the door, suddenly that became a bigger issue, yeah? Someone else, what did you say? Thank you. Yeah.
We've been saying as a parish for many a year we need to improve our communication. It has drastically improved.
Okay. You got one of those things on your... Did they help? You said for years that as a parish you wanted to improve your communication, and this was the moment where you did. Suddenly the crisis said, you can't afford not to do that now. Why? Because previously it was one of those things on the list that was either thought to be quite difficult to do or it would be nice if. But suddenly you realized that you needed to communicate better because you were all separated. But the truth is, a lot of your church would have felt separated before March. Yeah? Now, I don't know whether your church is like mine, but we've got a core of people who come every week, and then we've got a number of people who come once a month, but they think they're really committed. Now, I grew up in the Salvation Army, all right? Let me tell you what my Sundays were in the Salvation Army. At 10 o'clock, it was Sunday school. At 11 o'clock, it was the morning service. At 2 o'clock, it was the Sunday school. At 3 o'clock, it was the afternoon service. At 6 o'clock, it was the evening service. We grew up wanting to keep Sunday special. We were exhausted. And every year, we used to get a Sunday school prize, a book that indicated how many times you'd come. And it was out of 104. And if you didn't get 100, you were allowed to be away for up to 2 weeks. People would go, not so good this year. That was what I grew up with in what seems a very strange and weird world now. So commitment for us was you came 3 times on a Sunday. Now if you come 3 times in a month. So commitment's different. But the point is, these people in my congregation who come once or twice a month feel very committed to Jesus. It's easy for me to judge their lack of commitment to coming, as I can easily misjudge that as they're not very committed to Jesus. However, when I see them as church gathered and scattered, now I've got an absolute imperative to communicate all the time with them. Communication becomes really important. We learned that. We learned about the gifts we need. We learned about the communication we must engage with. What else did you say? Anybody else?
Want people to old people. They can't come to the building. They can't do the online. They haven't got it. They don't live with anybody. They can't see their children or anybody else. What they have is not God, but the television.
Okay. So the elderly group in the congregation who are not connected to the internet, who are not able to see family, who are isolated, they become a real concern for us. They become a real concern for us. I think that one of the things that the virus period has revealed is what it feels like to be that isolated. I also would want to suggest for some of those people, they felt that before. It's just now we recognize it. Some people before might not have met that many people in a week, but now we recognize it.
Yeah, on Facebook, Roseanne Barrett said, we learned phone calls matter. Praying together builds us up. Technology reaches far and wide, praise God. And Bev Jones said, to reach out to the lonely more, to be better at communicating with each other outside of the church building.
Brilliant, thank you. That's great. Thank you for those online comments. The comment about phone calls is really interesting because certainly a generation below me, I also, we all have our smartphones. But do you remember when mobile phones were to call? Do you remember those quaint days? And do you remember how we got more efficient? It's more efficient to text. But actually what we need is a call. And there's a danger, I think, that in our need to communicate, we go down the efficient route rather than the personal route. It takes much more time, but it's much more important. Thank you. Yeah, another one?
Sorry.
No, go.
Yeah, one more. Robert Archer said, as shoulders, again, we found our home group has been more important than ever. And we spend more time in prayer each day together with others on the phone and Zoom.
Okay.
I was going to say that I think we've learned small groups are really important, both positively, because those people in small groups have kind of lent into them. As Robert Archer is saying here, they've met on Zoom, they've prayed together. And I think we've learned negatively that those not in small groups, it's harder to bridge that between the scattered and the gathered without the personal relationships and regular contact of a small group.
Small groups really matter, and I think being able to put small groups online has meant that, certainly in my context, people have gone to small groups who would have gone, do you know what, I live too far away, it's too difficult, but now actually they've just committed to that, and I think we'll continue those online, even when we can go back. Some people hate it, some people go, do you know what, it may be second best, but it's a very good second best. Last one. The building is not the church. We are the church, gathered, scattered, wherever we are, and actually everything we are focused on is how do we minister to the church. Now, the simple, and it's not this is more of a rhetorical question, but it's a challenge to you to keep on thinking about. So if you are on the PCC, if you're on standing committee, and all of the other sort of things that you do, the question is, do your agendas reflect what you've learned? Does your agenda, do the things you talk about, do the things you require people to do they reflect what you've learnt in these last 6 months, or are your agenda still lagging behind with the old, essentially, is your agenda the same as it was this time last year? If your agenda is still the same as it was this time last year, on every level at which you're working, you've not really learnt the lessons that you say you've learnt. That sounds harsh, but I think it's true. Does that make sense? And so part of your task is to grab those lessons that you've learned and sort of morph them into the way of working going forward, because the world in its present form is passing away. And some things won't click back. For some people in your community life, they will not have worshipped together by the time they get back, post-vaccine. And we're all saying post-vaccine as though the vaccine is going to be like it'll solve everything. We know that vaccines are actually, I think there's, anyway, don't want to disappoint you. I think there's a whole thing, it's not just going to be like one shot and everything's. Some people won't worship together alongside someone else in a church context in total for between 12 and 18 months. Possibly. So it's not just how do we limp through this next 6 months. but actually how do we take the things that we've learned and transform what it means to be church? I think it's a brilliant opportunity. But it has to reflect then on your conversations, on your agendas, on the expectations, on who you actually invite to be part of your teams now, on what you prioritize, etc., etc., etc. Is that okay? Is that helpful? Let's just run through some slides. Can you take me to the next one? The next one. So what we're trying to do is help people see a whole life vision, that all of life matters to God. We've been talking up till now about very much the gathered context of our church life together, but actually we're also helping people to say, well, what does it mean when you're scattered? All of life matters. God is active and present in the whole of life. The church is a body of God's people called out for the sake of the world. And mission happens wherever and whenever we scatter. That's what lies behind a whole life vision. Next slide, please. And then the next one. So what we're doing is, as much as we are also trying to navigate as gathered church, what we're trying to do is help people navigate life in scattered contexts. So as leaders, you've got two tasks. One is, how does our gathered life work? What are the components of that? And on the second is the commitment to ensure that everybody who comes to worship with you, week by week, however that may be done at the moment, that they have a sense of what's God asking of me in these new days. You have people in business who are having to navigate really difficult situations. You will have people who are having to make people redundant, and they will feel awful about that, but how do you help them, support them, pray for them, help them navigate that? You will have people who will be made redundant or have been made redundant and cannot find work at this stage of their life. You will have people who are struggling because actually their teams are smaller, but the tasks feel more complicated and they feel under stress because they're not sure how to deal with that. Those are the lives that some of your congregation are already living. How do we help them get a perspective on that in that new world? The foundations are sure. We build with care. No one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. That's what Paul said. Can you take me to that slide? Thanks. Yeah. That's what Paul said earlier in the Corinthian letter. We're building with care. Jesus has laid the foundation of our life together as the God's people. And I know you know this, but remember that when he's speaking about that, about laying foundations, he's talking about the communities of God's people, not buildings. Because in Corinth, they didn't have them. They met together ad hoc in homes and wherever they could. It was, what does our life together? Our life together has to be built on the foundation of Jesus. Next slide. Last night, I spoke about being a disciple, that idea that in Antioch they were first called Christians, but actually they described themselves as disciples. And there's any number of definitions of what a disciple is. This is mine. I think it's helpful to an extent that it says, a disciple is someone learning to live the way of Jesus in their context at this moment. A disciple is someone learning to live the way of Jesus in their context at this moment. What I was trying to explore with that definition is this: that a disciple is not someone who simply comes to church and identifies themselves with a community of people. That's not a disciple. A disciple is not someone who simply drifts through their Christian life. A disciple is someone who is intentionally learning a countercultural way of living. And it's easy for us to forget that sometimes, but let me just remind you that every time, however you do that in this place, every time you recite the creed together, you tell a radically different story about the world than your neighbors believe. The creed itself offers you a worldview that is radically different than your neighbors. And much more particularly, perhaps, every time you pray the Lord's Prayer, you are praying something distinctly countercultural. Forgive us our sins as we forgive everybody who has hurt us, damaged us, sinned against us, been malign. Everybody who's sought to bring us down. We forgive them. It's a simple line. You've said it since you were a child, some of you. But the moment you pray that, that is not how most people react. If you hurt me, I'll either take you down if I can, or I will avoid you for the rest of my life. Forgiveness? You don't deserve it. And the moment you start praying the Lord's Prayer, you're in a different world. The moment you pray, may your kingdom come, you are saying, things are not right round here. Yeah? You're praying for regime change. Now, if you think everything's well with the world, and actually you don't really want the world to change that much, you should not be praying, may your kingdom come. May your will be done in Heswell, on the world, as it is in heaven. Suggests that actually there's a different way of looking at the world. In other words, what we're doing together, if people only knew, is deeply, deeply subversive. I used to do school assemblies, and every now and again, I'd get wheeled out for prize giving and stuff like that. And they'd say, could you come and do a little prayer? And I wanted to say, a little prayer? Do you know what you're asking for? Do you realize that if God answers any of these prayers right now, chaos would ensue? There used to be brilliant moments where I'd do an assembly and I'd talk about forgiveness or something. And then, this literally happened. The PE teacher stood up directly after me. He said, Neil may talk about forgiveness. I am not practicing it. Forgiveness doesn't work in the structures of our world. We are deeply, deeply subversive people. Disciples are learning the way of Jesus. That's why we do youth work. Because if we don't disciple our young people and our families, the culture is doing a fantastic job at it. It's not whether they get discipled or not, it's just in what way. Because the culture is doing a fantastic job of making them consumers, hedonists, and individualists. I'm not blaming young people. All I'm saying is, actually, if you want to disciple young people, you've got a job on. A disciple is learning the way of Jesus. In this context, the context of my life, the context I'm at, the stage of life I'm at, the challenges I'm facing, the joys I'm experiencing, in this context, at this moment, I am learning the way of Jesus. The first time you're given promotion at work, the first time you get a job, the first time you're given promotion at work, the first time you're asked to oversee a team at work, what's the way of Jesus look like here? The first time you're diagnosed with a serious, serious, life-threatening illness. Never been here before. What does it mean to walk the way of Jesus here? Never been told I've had cancer before. I'm facing it. I'm frightened to death. What does it mean to actually learn the way of Jesus in this context? The first time you experience a bereavement, etc., etc., etc. At this moment. And I think for some of those reasons, the definition helps us think, well, what are we doing here? And in a sense, what I'd like to suggest to you is that as leaders, what you're trying to do is help everybody who worships with you get to the moment where they go, I identify myself with Christ. I have surrendered to Jesus. I think the idea of what it means to be a Christian really sort of engages at this moment. You know, there's a sense in which becoming a Christian can feel like, and sometimes you hear it in people's testimonies, I was in a mess and I cried out to God, God, if you're there, help me. And God did, and now I'm a Christian. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad story. It's a very common story, and it's a very understandable story. But it's actually the story of a very immature Christian, because there's something much bigger happened at that moment. You see, the immature Christian thinks when they become a Christian, they enrolled God on their cause. I'm in a mess, can you help me? But the truth is, the moment you surrendered to Christ as Lord, he enlisted you on his. That's actually what was going on. That's why we believe that behind it, it wasn't that you chose Christ, but Christ chose you. It's why when, as a Christian, you look back at your own life at the moment where you became a Christian and you went, actually, I think the Spirit of God was now working and wrestling with me long before I submitted. Why? Because God was saying, I want you to be part of my cause. Not, I will help you with yours. What does Jesus do? He goes and he says to tradesmen, young tradesmen in first century Palestine, the equivalent of plasterers and joiners and electricians, and says, I want you to follow me because we're going that way. Jesus didn't say to the equivalent of the plasterers, joiners and electricians, so how can I make your life better? In fact, you know what's coming next. He says, I'll make your life worse. Come and follow me. You think you've got problems now catching fish? You wait. Because we're going this way. Now, in a sense, I think, I hope you understand what I mean by this bit. I think it takes a lifetime to be converted to that. Do you know what I mean by that? I don't mean you don't become a Christian till then, but I think
For that to fully grasp, I think my battery's worn out. It's like enough already stopped. No battery, keep going. No battery, keep going. Is that okay? Well, you need batteries for all now.
it's a very unsubtle way of saying enough now. Enough, stop. What was I saying? So, can you see what I'm trying to say? And your task as a worshiping community is to enable everybody to grasp that that's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And it takes a lifetime. It takes time. Don't judge people. Don't get impatient with people. Otherwise, you'll try and cut corners and you'll make them feel bad, as though guilting them into it will work. It doesn't. But give them an environment in which they can grow and know that that's actually what is both what is happening and what has happened and what God would want to. So essentially, when we bow, literally when we bow, we are saying, okay, we're going to go your way. That's what it means to become a Christian. And at that point, after that moment, everything else is, I'm learning the way of Jesus. I'm going to get it this wrong. I'm going to foul it up so many times, but actually I'm still learning the way of Jesus. And as brothers and sisters together, one of the greatest things we can do is ask one another, what are you learning about Jesus now? Most church communities find that conversation hard to have. We're great at the conversation that just goes, how you doing? We're great at that conversation. Some of us are quite good when people tell us how they're doing, because normally people will say, well, it's a bit tough at the moment. Some of us are great at going, we'll pray with you now. Some of us feel a bit awkward about that, and so some of us will say, I'll pray for you again. Or some of them might even find that language quite difficult, and so some of us will go, I'll be thinking of you. It's a very English way. And at that point, you sound like your neighbor who doesn't believe in a God who hears your prayer. But it's much more difficult sometimes for us to ask one another, in the midst of everything that you're encountering, what you're learning about the way of Jesus. What is the way of Jesus for you? And so because it's difficult, and because you're leaders, I'm going to ask you to do it. Can you take me to the next slide? What's helped you live as this sort of disciple of Jesus this year? And if you've struggled with that, what might that mean? Do you want to find one person or two people? Just to take a moment or two. This is really one of those things where you say, you go first. one slide and one question. The question that I want you to just think about while I show you this last slide is, what do you think is really important for you to carry away this morning? What's the thought that you have that's a dominant thought in your mind that you want to carry away and you don't want to lose? What's been significant? What have you heard? What's really worth keeping? That's the question. This is my final slide. I think these are questions that we need to be asking one another during this time. I personally think this is a reset moment for the church. I think it's almost like an enforced Sabbath, where pretty much everything that we were helter-skelter with paused in church life, and it's a reset moment where we can say, actually, let's think about who we are. I think these are the questions that we ought to be asking. What really matters? What really matters about our life together? And what can we do without? What do we give so much time to that actually now we go, we manage without that? What did the church do? And what did we do really well? And what did isolation feel like? And then, what does all of this mean for the shape of our pastoral care, our discipleship, our evangelism, our mission? I suppose, what would we have learned if this had just been a dress rehearsal for something else? It sounds melodramatic. But what if the world in its present form is passing away? And we have to learn new ways. What have we learned? What's mattered? And what does the shape of our ministry look like going forward? This is a Sabbath moment where you learn to reset. Jesus didn't tell us how to manage at a time of COVID, but the Spirit leads us. And He leads us well. Time's gone. And in half an hour's time, young people are going to come, so I've got to get a baseball cap on and some ripped jeans. But before you go, just some of you, what's the thing that you're carrying away with you that you don't want to lose? Just say it, and I'll repeat it so others can hear it. Confidence. Confidence in confidence in Jesus. I think that's really important to say that last one as well. A confidence in God, a confidence in Jesus, and a confidence in the fact that we also are amazing. We're British and we don't tend not to say that about each other. But actually, it's worth reminding that this is a beautiful group of people. What else do you want to carry? Something different, perhaps? Your lips were moving. I could see. You're the only person in the room that I could see the lips move. And to be honest, I got my hopes up. But I now realize you were just breathing, which I suppose is better than not. But anybody else? What are you going to carry away with you? Yes? Okay. So we can use what we've got. We've got big buildings. You're blessed here with a big building. You can get a lot of people socially distanced in. Use what you've got. What else do you want to carry away with you? Pardon? Stay red when you scatter. At the back there, yeah.
Spending more time in prayer and listening
Brilliant. Thank you for all those contributions online. Any last ones here? What? Oh, okay, he's calling you. He's equipping you. Someone else, what are you carrying away?
I struggled so much with technology at first. I got really stressed. And God clearly said to me, don't rely on things that are unreliable, rely on me.
Okay,
And that really spoke to
that helped you at the time, yeah.
me. Much more relaxed now.
Fantastic.
Technology.
Fantastic. Should be on the Microsoft help page, shouldn't it? Anything else that you're carrying away that's worth holding? Yeah. I don't know if you heard that at the front of the church. It's a different view from the back of the church, folks. I'm telling you this. Talked about hope, the great hope we have, that Jesus leads, that we've got. There is hope. And even in this situation, that as we listen to what the Spirit is saying and we follow, then put some of this stuff into practice, reflect, but actually there's hope for the future. One person put their hand up, and this is the last one. Everyone has a purpose. No one's left out. Everybody is included. My time's gone. I'm going to pray for you. Thank you for coming out this morning. I kind of hope that it's been helpful. Father God, may your Spirit rest on these people. You called them, some of them decades ago, to your purpose, and you have used them and worked with them and worked through them for decades. And I pray for a renewed purpose and vision in their own lives. One that doesn't drive them, but the one that leads them into everything you have for them. Lord, I pray for them collectively, that as they think through the ministry of the church together in its gathered form, I pray that it would indeed be a congregation, a community of people that equips one another for everything they're facing right now. I pray for their scattered lives. Lord, that you may make them a blessing, transformational blessing to the people to whom you send them. Lord, may your grace and your peace and your Spirit rest on these folks at this time, in the name of Jesus. Amen.